Right, this second part of our chapter in sociological research, we'll look at 4 different research methods that scholars employed in order to collect data. One of the 4 methods that scholars, sociologists in particular, usually employed is surveys. This is the data collected from subjects, often through a series of questions to ask subjects for their opinions and behaviors. And these questions are often in the form of a questionnaire. The questionnaire can be printed on a paper, or nowadays could be distributed online and collected online from participants as well, may be sent out to subjects by mail. And not so much anymore, but there are sometimes surveys that are done over the phone as well. So the goal of surveys is to establish causality or cause and effect between 2 variables in order to understand why people behave a certain way, or how their behaviors might have impacts on certain social phenomena, or vice versa. Certain social phenomena have impacts on their behaviors. So, for example, does smoking encourage people to sleep better? That's just one question, a social question. Or does smoking enable subjects to feel more at ease in a group with strangers? So is smoking kind of like an social oil, so that way people could talk to strangers? So again, these are just some sample questions, and hopefully with surveys, scholars can detect the causality between at least 2 variables. In this case, smoking and behavior or relationship with strangers, an example that I just gave you. So a part of collecting surveys include having a hypothesis, which I briefly mentioned in part 1 already. A hypothesis is a testable educated guess about predicted outcomes between 2 or more variables. And the 2 variables, at least, that you must have in any scientific study is the independent variables, which are variables that cause changes in dependent variables. And of course, dependent variables is a variable changed by other variables. So here I gave you an example, a visual image of what independent and dependent variables are. So independent variables, they occur independently of the dependent variables. In this case, amount of water or amount of fertilizer. Now the effect that we'll see of the amount of water and amount of fertilizer is on the height of the plant. So as you can see, height of the plant as a dependent variable depends on the amount of water and or the amount of fertilizer that the plants get. So in this case, we have 2 independent variables, the amount of water and amount of fertilizer. And we have 1 dependent variable, which is the height of the plant. Again, the height of the plant depends on, in this case, in our study, we're looking at amount of water and amount of fertilizer. Now, let's give you an example of a social, something might be a sociological question is, the question is, are test scores impacted by the amount of time spent sleeping the night before a test? Here, as you can see, the independent variable is amount of time spent sleeping, and the dependent variable is the grade that you get on your test. So again, does the amount of time that you have sleeping impact your test? Okay. By the way, I can see in this picture that This example is for an experiment and not a survey. I'm including this picture with the whole purpose of demonstrating to you the difference between independent and dependent variables only. These two variables can be observed within the surveys or within an experiment, which is another method that we will discuss soon. So one of the first steps of designing a survey is to determine the population, the target group that is the focus of the study, and then select a sample, which include individuals from within the target population who are intended to represent the population to be studied. So a sample is a subpopulation of the population. They're smaller. And ideally, we're selecting a sample that includes individuals with elements or characteristics that are representative of the population. Ideally, the samples are randomly chosen, right, in which everyone in the population has an equal chance of being selected in the sample. So that would be a random sample. A stratified random sample is a sample of a specific group, like let's say freshmen, sophomores, junior, of a target population. So the target population might be college or university students, right, in which everyone in the subgroup has an equal chance of being included in the study. So as you can see here, so with my college university population, I stratified it so that way I make sure that let's say I want to choose 100 college or university students, but I want to make sure I have 25 freshmen, 25 sophomore, 25 student juniors, and 25 seniors. So as you can see, I stratify. I make sure that all the students in 4 levels have the equal chance, are well represented in my sample. So if I were to just do this randomly, it's possible that I may get 50 freshmen, 40 sophomore, 5 juniors, and 5 seniors, which I may not want. I want to make sure that, again, I want it to be represented across all levels, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. So again, this would be stratified random sampling. So ideally in any survey, the respondents, those who respond to my survey, must be allowed to express their own ideas, so that way the findings will not be biased. And we want to make sure that our questionnaires can be administered either by asking respondents to complete the survey themselves, so this would be self-administered surveys, or by asking respondents the questions directly. So this would be interviews. So the interviews could be one-on-one interviews, or it could be a small group interview, for example. And as a researcher, I must always consider the fact that the interviews may have, either I myself or the interviewers have on respondents that might lead to biased answer. And I must also be aware of whether or not to make the question structured. So close-ended questions, for example, in which answers provided, or unstructured. So this would be open-ended questions in which people can answer in their own words. So it's open. That's why it's called open-ended. And a part of doing survey is another thing that scholars always must be aware of, is to establish rapport or feeling of trust with their subjects. And so related to my comments that I just talked about when it comes to collecting data, open-ended, closed-ended questions. So the data that we can collect from our surveys can be quantitative or qualitative data. Quantitative data tends to be more close-ended because they can be usually in numerical form, or can be converted into numerical form, and they can be easily tabulated. So they can be easily, for example, put in a program, Excel sheet, and then graph the data, for example. Qualitative data, on the other hand, are usually the kinds of data that I get from open-ended surveys. and so the data are oftentimes subjective, and it's very difficult to quantify. So in this case, I may have to, the way in which I analyze it may not necessarily be in charts, for example, but might include themes. So themes of the kinds of issues that people share in their qualitative data. So here I'm sharing with you a comparative chart of how quantitative and qualitative research methods are different from each other. Each has its own benefits and goals. Neither is better than the other. You don't have to go too much into detail about this yet until you take a research methods class. But I just wanted to present to you to show you that each method has its own goals and purposes. So quantitative data usually is about trying to understand causality. It's able to be much more generalizable. So because quantitative data is oftentimes able to collect, surveys from a lot of people, right? Large samples, right? On the other hand, qualitative data, they emphasize meanings, right? Or subjective opinions that subjects share with the researcher or interviewers. So the data they get is much more context-rich, more specific, and it's less generalizable. But the focus here again is more the meanings that are attached to the ways in which the subjects answer the questions. So, for example, give you an example to give you a comparison between quantitative and qualitative research methods. So, if my question is to try to understand how many students at our college are dating, right, are in a romantic relationship. So I would, do a survey and say, are you in a romantic relationship? And then I would tabulate that, and I find out, among freshmen, 25% are in a romantic relationship, sophomore, 10%, junior, 34%, senior, 55%. So that's just an example. Right? So I would use quantitative data to understand how many students among within the student population are in a romantic relationship. However, if my research question is how do people act in a loving relationship, or how do people feel that they're being loved by their partner? See, the question how, right? How someone is feeling loved, or how they're receiving love, that is very difficult to quantify. And so in such a case, I would most likely do interviews with people to understand, say, how do you feel loved by your partner? Please share with me. So as you can see, it's much more open-ended. So people might say, well, I feel loved when my partner texts me every morning, when my partner makes sure that we go and have some, make dinner together on a Friday night, and so on, right? So it's endless, right? So it's very open-ended. So again, in this case, it's qualitative. It's more, there's more richness to the answer that respondents share. On the other hand, because it's so, I'm talking to so many, to people, and I want to understand their perspectives, their subjective opinions. I can't interview everyone. I just don't have the resources and time to do that. Unlike in the survey, it's just a box, right? It's like, are you in a romantic relationship? Check, done, right? Whereas qualitative, it requires a lot more time, right, to discuss a topic with your respondents. I mean, at least if you're trying to be a good researcher, you would take time to talk to someone about that. So again, this is just to give you a general overview, just to see that, to understand that, both quantitative and qualitative research methods, for at least, or data for data in methods such as surveys are good in themselves, but which one to use depends on your research question. Okay, let's move on to the next research method, which is field research. Here in this case, oftentimes the researchers would go out collect the primary data from a naturally occurring social environment, and that when they go out there, they would either observe what's going on around them, or sometimes they would participate in the environment as well. So unlike surveys, the goal of field research is to observe correlation, not causation. They want to understand. So in causality, your question might be trying to understand why people behave a certain way, and you collect a lot of data. In field research, your question might be, how do people behave a certain way? You see the word how? So how here is trying to get at the meanings, the richness, the subjective experience or motivations that people have behind their behaviors or the ways in which they perceive the world. So in field research, the concept of an interpretive framework is very important. In this framework, right, the researchers, the sociologists, seek to understand a particular topic, right, or the subject through their own observation or interaction with the social environment, right? So in this approach, they're not trying, again, as I mentioned, they're not trying to test causality. They're trying to understand exactly, they emphasize more, there's more emphasis on how do people, the subjects, experience their lives, or how do they share their opinions about certain issues that the scholars is very interested in studying. Now, because in field research, scholars are interacting with their subjects, and the environment in which their subjects live in, there is potentially biased data that can be potentially collected. So this, one of the biases can occur is called a Hawthorne Effect. This is an effect in which subjects might act differently because that they know that they're being observed. So they might be nicer, they might perform, right, to be good so that way they don't look bad, and so on, right? So researchers need to be aware of the Hawthorne Effect so that way they do not get biased information. So one way in which researchers might be able to address the Hawthorne Effect is to spend a long time in the field, build rapport with their subjects, and almost what scholars sometimes call to go native, right? The researchers themselves become almost like part of the community in which the subjects are part of, and so their status as researchers do not matter as much anymore. It's up to a point where subjects aren't even aware of it anymore. Okay, so that, again, that's just one of the many ways in which scholars can try to reduce the Hawthorne Effect on the data in which they collect. So a part of the field research is participant observations, which I alluded to already, which is when researchers go out there and observe observe a group in their natural setting while participating as well. And this is a really, really cool video about a sociologist who became a gang leader for a day, and he actually wrote a book about it, but here I'm including a trailer for you just to give you an overview of what this scholar did. He's a sociologist, what he did, how he was able to gain trust and from a gang and be able to study them, live with them, and actually became a gang leader for a day. So how did he do that? Yeah, so it's very, very interesting to read this book, but if you don't have time, I encourage you to pause this video and watch this short YouTube video. So go ahead and pause, and then we'll continue. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that video. So let's go on to the next idea, ethnography, which is also part of field research method. In ethnography, which is very similar to custom observation, except that in ethnography, the researchers spend a lot more time with the subjects, and they really truly want to understand their perspective and cultural values of the whole entire social setting in which they're studying. And institution ethnography, which is a subfield of ethnography, they try to focus on everyday social relationships and try to understand the perspectives, the motivation, the unique subjective motivations of the subjects themselves, in order to understand why and how they behave a certain way, why and how they behave differently from other subjects. Case study, which is also part of field research. In case study, a researcher would choose to study a single event, situation, or individual, rather than studying a big group or big sector of our society. Instead, they focus on a specific group to study, and hopefully by studying this particular group, they hope that it would lend light on some sort of social phenomena. One very interesting case study is Oksana Malaya, and she is a Russian girl who was raised by dogs, and this was not an experiment. It just so happened that her parents neglected her, and she ended up almost living with dogs, and she ended up acting very much like dogs. So this is a very particular case study that scholars are study in order to understand, for example, how feral children, children who are not raised by parents, grow up and behave, and whether or not they can be socialized to become, social human beings, who act, like us again. Okay, so I encourage you to pause this video and then pause this video in order to watch that short YouTube video about this case study. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that short video. So let's go on into our third method. The research method is experiments. This is a research method in which a hypothesis is being tested under control conditions. So what this means is that ideally you are observing only two variables and seeing whether or not there is causal relationship between at least these two variables. So I include this image of this woman with, in one case she's without makeup, the other one is no makeup, everyday makeup, and full face, full slop. Obviously the difference is the level of her makeup, the makeup that she is wearing, and perhaps the experiment is to see how people relate to her, based on what she's wearing, right? So again, one variable has changed, which is her makeup, and then the other thing, so that would be the independent. That would be the independent variables, and the dependent variable is how people would relate to her based on how much makeup she is wearing. So this is an experiment, and it's a fun experiment, but I thought that it hopefully illustrate to you what an experiment is. So last but not least, our fourth research method is secondary data analysis. So in this case, the data has already been collected by other researcher, and it's being used by the current researcher in order to analyze it or expand upon it in order to understand furthermore about certain social phenomena. the issue, the great thing about secondary data analysis is, first of all, the researcher doesn't have to collect the data. The data has already been collected by other researchers or by other sources, like newspapers, U.S. Census, Facebook, and so on. So it's great if you're trying to do research in which your role as a researcher would not directly impact the data, because again, the data have already been collected by other sources. However, because the researcher did not directly carry out the research to collect the data, he or she cannot be sure that the data were systematically gathered and accurately recorded, and biases were avoided. So again, as with other research methods, there are some great things about this method, as well as some limitations as well. And as scholars, you must always be aware of, first of all, what kind of research questions you're trying to answer, and secondly, therefore, which method would be best to answer your questions. So this ends our second part.